Aloha class. Today we are going to discuss Indonesia's musical culture, and I've titled this presentation Lesson 10.1, The Tapestry of Cultures, Indonesia in the 21st Century. And of course, as we go on to the next slide, we see that a tapestry is something that is considered to be rich, varied, or intricately interwoven, and originally referred to a certain kind of fabric work that typically hung on walls, kind of an artwork or a rug for a wall, if you will. So now we use that term metaphorically to describe anything that's intricately interwoven, and Indonesia's multi-ethnic culture is certainly one of those things. Indonesia has what we call a pluralistic culture, meaning that no one ethnic group is dominant. Well, I shouldn't say dominant, but in the majority. And we'll see what the distinction is there as we go along. There is one ethnic group that is dominant. So Indonesia's pluralistic culture is Balinese, Sumatran, Sulawesian, Moluccan, Javanese, and there are some that I'm leaving out here. But 49% are Javanese, so that is the near majority, and that is the dominant culture, as you will come to find out. Now, the population is over 200 million, and that makes it the fifth most populous nation in the world. This nation was formed from a Dutch colony. So before colonization, there was maybe a loose confederation of different island groups, different geocultural ethnicities in that area. But when the Dutch colonized that area, it became a more broad Dutch East Indies kind of collection. And after World War II, when they gained independence from the Netherlands, they made a nation from that grouping, that colonial grouping. So the colonists made the original alliances of these different ethnic groups, not the indigenous people. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here in terms of diversity, even on the island of Java, there are distinct regional cultures. We have a West Javanese kind of culture, East Javanese, Central Javanese. And when this republic was formed after World War II, the leaders saw a need to create this feeling of unity among these disparate groups. And so they created a national motto, unity in diversity. And that sounds a little bit like some of the mottos we see whenever it's time to elect BYUHSA officers, student government officers. We see something like many hearts, one mind, something like that. Different things I've seen around campus during those campaigns. And so unity and diversity sounds a little bit like that idea. Now let's talk a little bit about the religious and colonial influences. And again, after we've studied a number of different cultures so far in this class, a lot of this process and the results of that process will sound a little bit familiar to you. In the first millennium AD, we had kind of a more pre-Christian culture there, and even pre-Islamic culture, animistic, shamanistic, those two ways of approaching spirituality. Shamanism has to do with ancestor worship and being in touch with the spirits of the ancestors. Then in the second millennium, about 1000 to 1400, there was an influx of both Hinduism and Buddhism. Hinduism from India, Buddhism from continental East Asia. From the 15th century onward, Islam was brought by Middle Eastern traders, and today 80% of the population of Indonesia is at least nominally Muslim. That makes it the most populous Muslim nation on the earth. Now, the brand of Islam that's practiced there feels a little bit different, has a little bit different manifestation than the Middle Eastern kind of Islam. But still, we have that distinction that it is a largely Islamic nation. Now, when I say nominally, it's the idea of some people adhering to that faith by tradition of their families, more than being active practitioners of that faith. And as I mentioned before, we had a very important impact from the Dutch colonization from the 17th century that lasted all the way till the mid-1900s. Now, as we shift our focus to the music, the traditional music of Indonesia, and specifically in this unit, looking at the music of Java and the music of Bali, we need to talk about the perceived power of bronze. Bronze was used extensively to make instruments for this type of music. And during pre-contact times, again, pre-contact meaning before European contact, Indonesia's court music was its art or classical music. We had two main Javanese court cities, and they're still considered to be centers of history and culture in Indonesia today. Yogyakarta, which has a nickname of Jogja, and Surakarta, which has a nickname of Solo. And the trademark musical ensemble of Indonesia is the gamelan. And gamelan refers both to the orchestra, so to speak, the ensemble of instruments, and it refers to the type of music, the genre that they create. So this orchestra, as you can see in this photograph here, is dominated by bronze idiophones. They also include membranophones, which you can see in the center of the photograph, aerophones, which you'll see later on, and chordophones, which you'll also see later on. I need to mention here on this slide, you see a reference to a text, and by now I think everyone knows that we have decided not to use that text for this online class. So as in previous presentations, when you see those references, you can ignore them. Let's talk a little bit more about gamelan music, and here we have a photograph with a more aerial view so you can look down on the orchestra and you can get a sense of the different bronze instruments, sizes and shapes and ways of playing. And gamelan music is all about layered musical structure. We have some primary melodic instruments, which are the bronze idiophones of the saron family, and we'll see those a little more closely as we go. We have something called the colotomic instruments that define the rhythmic cycle. Colotomic is a term that a music historian, a music specialist came up with to describe the cycle of music. It's somewhat like a meter or a time signature in the West, but it again is more nuanced and usually a little more complex. So in the back of this photo, you see hanging gongs of different sizes. And they would be the main colotomic instruments, and when you hear the music, you'll hear how they help to define the different points in the rhythmic cycle. Membranophones, which we see painted in red on the left-hand side of this photo, create a rhythmic elaboration. So we have something similar to the African concept of timeline and variations, where the colotomic instruments, the gongs, can create senses of the different pulses within the cycle, and the membranophones will elaborate and create variations on that particular timeline. Then we have melodic elaborating instruments. Some of them are pitched bronze idiophones, and looking at this photo, some of the smaller ones would be considered to be the elaborating instruments. And you also have the rebob, the fiddle chordophone, which you'll see a little more close up later on, and the suling, the flute aerophone. Again, I have a note to study a transcription in the text, and we're going to approach this a different way in the PowerPoint. Let's talk about the main tuning scales and tuning systems here. You see a photograph of a melodic elaborating instrument kind of up close, and you'll notice that it has 5 bars. So we have a scale called the Cilindro scale, which is a 5-tone scale. And we're going to take a look at a short excerpt, 3 minutes, where we see and hear the sound of this scale. Excuse me, of course we don't see the sound of the scale. You know what I meant. Okay, for some of you, that's your first introduction to gamelan music, and you hear that kind of bell, kind of metallic sound, and you might get a sense of, exotic, Far East kind of connotation there. That's our own ethnocentrism kicking in. But we'll kind of unpeel this. Unpeel, that's not a word, is it? We're going to peel the layers of this metaphorical onion as we go through. Now, let's talk about the Pelag scale, 7-tone scale. And if you think about do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, count them up, and you start over at do again, there are 7 tones in that scale. But this particular scale is very different. We'll be sure that we put a little chart from the book on the course materials so you can take a look at this, because it's an interesting chart to compare the intervals between the major scale intervals and the Pelag scale intervals, and also look at the Slendro scale intervals while we're at it. Okay, we have another example here. Oh, and I should mention, you notice some distinctly non-Indonesian faces in that first YouTube excerpt, and I'm pretty sure that this particular video was taken at a university in the Netherlands. And you would expect, of course, with the Dutch colonial influence there, that there would be aspects of that culture that came back to the colonizing country, and people there pursued an interest in learning about those traditions. But it's also become very popular in the United States. No direct colonial ties, but the idea of non-Western music and gamelan being very distinct, and different universities, like the next one we'll see, University of California at Berkeley, or Cal Berkeley, who purchase these instruments. We'll see some excerpts before we're done from the University of Hawaii down in Manoa, who also purchased several sets of these instruments and maintained them and maintained an ensemble as part of the university non-Western music offerings. So here's Cal Berkeley, and look at an excerpt of this in the in the Pelag scale system. Now, if your non-Indonesian ear could not pick up the difference between the Slendro scale and the Pelag scale, you're not alone. That's pretty common. It took me a long time to be able to pick up on the nuances. But just know that there are distinctive scales. Is it like the major-minor system in European-derived music? In a sense, in a rough parallel, but it's a lot different in terms of the intervals comparing the Western systems and the Indonesian systems.